Know, O Prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Ares, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. Nemedia, Ophir, Brythunia, Hyperborea, Zemara, with its dark-haired women on towers of spider-haunted mystery, Zingara, with its chivalry, Koth, that bordered on the pastoral lands of Shem, Stygia, with its shadow-guarded tombs, Hyrcania, whose riders wore steel and silk and gold. But the proudest kingdom of the world was Aquilonia, reigning supreme in the dreaming west. Hither came Conan, the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. That, my friends, is from the Nemedian Chronicles, which you can find at the beginning of the first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword. Welcome, my friends, welcome to stately Vaughn Manor, and we're finally talking about The Phoenix on the Sword for the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show today. And we're going to be talking about The Phoenix on the Sword, which can be found in this terrific volume, The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian by Robert E. Howard. So, we're going to be talking about the Conan stories, and we're going to be talking about them in the order that Robert E. Howard wrote the stories. And that is the order that they are presented in the Del Rey edition of Conan. And it's kind of exciting to be finally talking about Conan, the greatest hero that Robert E. Howard came up with. Robert E. Howard, the greatest pulp writer of all time. And practically, at least, the inventor of sword and sorcery. Certainly, he revolutionized sword and sorcery. I suppose Lord Dunsany deserves the actual credit for creating sword and sorcery, but really, Robert E. Howard, he made it what it was. So yes, on to The Phoenix on the Sword, the first Conan story. So The Phoenix on the Sword, which was published in, when was it published? I've got it written down. It was published in December of 1932 in Weird Tales. So 1932, it's sort of startling to realize that the first Conan story was written only a few years before Robert E. Howard's death. So he only had a few years left, Robert E. Howard did, in his short writing career, to write all of these incredible stories of Conan the Barbarian. Or in this case, Conan the King, because in his first appearance, we see Conan as the king of Aquilonia. He has reached the height of his ambitions. And now he has to live with his ambitions and what they have led him to, which is being in a position of responsibility. A position that, well, on second thought, maybe isn't so great, because he doesn't get to go out and have as much fun as he did before he became the king. And the burdens of kingship, well, they lie heavy upon the throne. This is a great story, The Phoenix on the Sword. I've talked about the story that this was sort of based on, which was By This Axe I Rule, which was a King Kull story that was never published. I did a video on the King Kull story, By This Axe I Rule. I'll link it down below so you can check it out if you're interested. But Kull was Robert E. Howard's first attempt at a fantasy character quite kind of like this, where you had a fantasy character in a fantasy world created out of whole cloth And Kull, there were some really good Kull stories, but Kull wasn't the success that Robert E. Howard had hoped. Only a few Kull stories were printed. And so, since this particular story that he wrote, called By This Axe I Rule, was not published, he felt free to take that story, since nobody was ever going to see it, and just rework it into this story, The Phoenix on the Sword. And he really didn't think anyone would ever see it. I mean, why would he expect anyone to see this story that was not published? He had no idea that years and years after his death, all of the Kull stories that he wrote and that were not published would be published in a Kull volume. That would be quite a surprise, I think, to Robert E. Howard. So he had this story idea, and it was a good story idea, but there were certain things about it that did not work. At least they didn't work for Weird Tales, the magazine where he wanted to get it published. For one thing, there was no overt supernatural element in the story By This Axe I Rule, except that it was in a fantasy world. Now, sometimes in Weird Tales, that was enough. There were stories in Weird Tales that just were stories that took place in a fantasy world, and it was okay for those stories, but not for this one, apparently. So that was one thing Robert E. Howard decided he wanted to change. There was also a subplot involving two lovers who could not be together, which was a subplot that Robert E. Howard kept trying to use in the Kull stories, and it never really worked. So he just got rid of it completely, which was wise. And he changed his character from Kull to Conan. A different character that he had had on his mind, and a character with a very different personality than Kull did. Kull, who is always brooding and dark. Conan was not that way. As you saw from that little bit I read from the Nemedian Chronicles, he had not just tremendous melancholies, but tremendous mirth. Conan was a lot more fun than Kull was. You get that feeling that you would much rather hang out with Conan, that you'd have a much better time with Conan. Kull was also always so broody that he was not interested in women or romance at all. Conan, very different. He liked the ladies quite a bit. You don't see all of those differences in this story, though. Probably, this is the story where Conan and Kull are the closest, although you do see a little bit of difference if you read both stories. Now, at this point, Conan is the king of Aquilonia after being a bunch of different things. He has been a thief. He has been a pirate. He has been a mercenary. He has been a bunch of stuff. Now, Kull was also a character that had been a bunch of stuff before he became king. But in the Conan series, you're actually going to see a lot of that stuff. But at this point, he's already done all that, and now he has reached the pinnacle of his ambition. He has become the king of the greatest nation in his world. And he did it, through his own cleverness and strength. But he is a barbarian. He is a foreigner, which makes his position a little more unstable than it might otherwise be. There are people who really, really don't want Conan to be king. People who want the kingship and the power for themselves. Now, even though Conan is a pretty darn good king, and he's actually good for the common people being what they are, people, they're subject to the influence of lies and propaganda. And so there are people who are being convinced that, maybe Conan, even though he's a great king, shouldn't be king. So there's that going on. There is some unrest in the kingdom which is these flames are being fanned by these conspirators. There is a bandit who has been called in out of the desert. A bandit who had one time had political ambitions before he was forced out and forced to become a bandit. But he has been called in, and he has become the ringleader of a band of conspirators who want to bring Conan down. This follows right along with the plot from By This Axe I Rule. So these conspirators get together and they conspire to murder Conan in his chamber at night. The leader of the guards has been bribed and leads away his guards so that this little group of conspirators can sneak in and kill Conan when he's not expecting them. Now, there are a couple other things going on in this story that actually don't happen in the original King Kull version. For one, we get our first glimpse of Thoth-Amon, the terrifying wizard, who really only appears in this story. In the original Conan stories, Robert E. Howard stories. He does become quite important in the comic book Conan, and if you read the 9 million pastiche novels of Conan that are written by other people that aren't Robert E. Howard, Thoth-Amon makes appearances. But in this series, the real series of Conan, Thoth-Amon just kind of shows up here. And he doesn't show up as you might expect as a powerful wizard. He shows up as a slave because his power has been broken. See, Thoth-Amon used to have this magic ring that helped him have great power. And the magic ring was stolen from him, and his power was broken because of his rivals. So he curses the day when he lost his magic ring that gave him his power. And he has sunk so low that he has become a slave of this bandit. But in the course of this story, he runs into one of the conspirators who has this magic ring, who has gotten a hold of this ring. Well, that's all Thoth-Amon needs. There's a great picture in this volume. This volume has some great illustrations. And the illustrations in this volume are done by Mark Schultz. And there's Thoth-Amon finally getting his ring back. He's gloating there because now he has his ring of power. Now, it's tempting to think that perhaps J.R.R. Tolkien read this story. We know that Tolkien was familiar and fond of Conan. So, you never know. Maybe he got this idea of the magic ring from Conan. Probably not. He didn't. But there is a magic ring here that Thoth-Amon finally gets, which will give him his power back. And the first thing he does to get revenge on the bandit who's been enslaving him and abusing him all this time is to send a big monster after him. And he says, you know what? You go off, you find this bastard, and you kill him, and you just kill everybody who's with him. Unfortunately, at this moment, the bandit is leading these conspirators to slaughter Conan while he's unsuspecting. But Conan has a dream. He has a dream where he goes to the tomb of Epimetrius, who is an ancient sage whose spirit sometimes goes forth from his tomb to help Aquilonia, the kingdom of Aquilonia, when it is in danger. And right now, with this threat to Conan, the king of Aquilonia, who's a darn good king, Aquilonia is in danger. So his spirit seeks out Conan to warn him. And the scene where Conan is walking around in this tomb is really cool because we do get a Lovecraft reference, actually, in this first Conan story. As Conan is wandering through the tomb, there are all these gods and monsters and stuff on the walls of the tomb. And he recognizes, the outlines. And he shuddered to see the vast, shadowy outlines of the nameless old ones. The nameless old ones. Well, we know where those guys came from. That's straight out of Lovecraft. This is something Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, being pals, that they frequently did. They referenced each other in their stories. So, you know, Conan, part of the Cthulhu mythos, I guess, if you want to stretch a point. But he runs into Epimetrius there, Conan does, who not only warns him of danger, but carves, with his hand, he carves the symbol of a phoenix onto Conan's sword. And the sword is given magical powers against evil, which becomes very important at the end of the story, which I'm not going to spoil too much, except that Conan is warned. He wakes up and he knows trouble's coming. So he's getting ready in his armor so that when the conspirators show up, he's ready for them, which they don't expect. And he puts up a much better fight than they thought he would. But remember, Thoth Amon has sent a monster. And that causes a lot of trouble too. So I'll leave it there because I've probably spoiled enough of this plot. But there are a lot of really interesting things about the first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword. First of all, it's an excellent story. It's a great beginning to this series. I think that this version of the story is better than the King Kull version. I think the supernatural elements work great. Thoth Amon is a great character, even though he's only here for a little bit. He's impressive as a villain in the little bit that he's in. He's excellent. All the characters are really well done, even though most of them we only see for a short time. It's interesting to see some of the changes made in the story. Mostly this has to do with minor characters being changed. Brule the Spear Slayer, Kull's best friend, is changed into Prospero, who we never see much of. Other characters' names are changed to become the characters in Conan's kingdom. There are a few tales of Conan as a king. Not many, but there are a few. Probably the most notable being The Hour of the Dragon, which we'll get to later, which was Robert E. Howard's only full-length novel. Nowadays, I guess it wouldn't be considered full-length, considering how long books are now, but it is a full-length novel of Conan, where Conan is a king, and that's a great story. I look forward to getting to that one. But this story has a lot of points of interest, particularly since it kind of begins in a way that you wouldn't expect. Conan, the big, strong barbarian. If you don't already know Conan, if you're starting to read this book and you only know Conan from the comic book or the movies especially, or that awful TV show, and my goodness, there was even a cartoon. There was. If you only know Conan from that, you're going to be surprised by the Conan in this, because Conan is a smart guy. You can see how he rose to power. He's clever, this guy. And in fact, the first scene that you get of Conan is not him fighting or being barbaric. He's sitting at a desk and he's drawing a map. He's drawing a map of the countries that aren't commonly known by the civilized countries. Cimmeria, his own country, being one of them. This is not an image of Conan that you're going to expect, but this is the first image of Conan that you see. Now, don't worry. Only a few pages later, he's killing folks. So he goes full-on barbarian really quickly. But that is interesting. That is an interesting opening to this whole Conan saga. And it's a worthwhile opening, the story is. So next week, we're going to go from Conan at the end of his career to Conan at the very beginning of his career. Next week, we're going to be talking about a short story called The Frost Giant's Daughter that was never published in Weird Tales, but was a heck of a story. But that, for this week, is your Robert E. Howard Show. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch you next time.